Hello, and thank you for choosing to listen to the Lift as We Rise podcast. My name is Roshni Gajjar. Whether you are a regular listener or new, every receptive ear matters to shape and steer sustainable, purpose-driven strategies. Risk management is a key enabler of strategy, and if done well, it strengthens organizational and systemic resilience. Every year, the World Economic Forum launches its risk report. This year, climate action failure, extreme weather, and biodiversity loss put environmental risks at the top of the risk registers for global leaders, followed by societal risks. On the 24th of February this year, the Institute of Risk Management South Africa launched its 8th edition of the IRMSA Risk Report. Of course, since both the release of these reports, climate change and the COVID pandemic have been overshadowed by something we thought would never happen in this era, and that is the war in Europe. That has added more uncertainty and more complexity to the leadership agenda, even in South Africa. So today, to unpack the South African IRMSA risk report for us against this global backdrop, I'm speaking to Nicola Comninos, the Chief Risk Officer at the JSE and also Vice President of IRMSA. Joining Nicola on the panel is Christopher Palm, who's the Chief Risk Advisor at IRMSA. Nicola and Christopher, thank you so much for making time and for speaking to us today.
Good morning. Delighted to be here. Thank you.
Morning, Christopher. Hi, Nicola.
Lovely to be here. Thanks, Roshni.
So you're both joining us from Joburg, and I'm sitting here in Port Elizabeth, and we're all wearing jackets, which is unusual for Lift as We Rise. But let me tell you, listeners, it is pretty chilly, and I think winter's arrived quite early in South Africa. So before we dive into it, let's set the scene for our listeners, on the assumption that not everyone listening in today is a professional risk manager or a C-suite. So we started off in South Africa in 2022 with the release of the first Zondo Commission report. We still had serious political and socio-economic challenges that we were grappling with, and also an accelerated brain drain of skills from South Africa. So, Nicola and Christopher, as we know, risks don't appear overnight. Those red flags give us the warning signals long before the event happens. From the JSE and from IRMSA's perspective, is risk management generally a well-applied and relevant practice across South African businesses and institutions? Nicola, let's start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Roshni. Look, I have to admit, I think it probably is a little bit of a mixed bag. In the couple of years that I've been in the role of the Group Chief Risk Officer of the JSE, I've certainly had a lot more exposure to other individuals that carry the same title. But it doesn't, it's not something that is prevalent in every organization. And I would also like to add that irrespective of whether you actually officially have someone that bears the title of the Chief Risk Officer, for me, it's more about, does your organization have some more strategic thinking in place? Does your organization take time out to think about all of those uncertainties that we are faced with? There's a lot of acronyms being used, a VUCA world as an example, really just taking, appropriate executive time out to sit and unpack all of those uncertainties that could either be a threat to your business or an opportunity. And so I've seen some organizations, I would say in the last sort of 2 to 3 years, using more scenario planning and futures thinking a lot more proactively. And so irrespective of whether you have someone with that title of risk manager, you are effectively doing risk management and proactively planning and looking at your strategic objectives and saying what will potentially happen that could either negatively impact me or could help me catapult my business to a completely different level from an opportunities perspective. So that's been really positive for me to start seeing that. But when I have discussions on any forum just about risk management, I often talk about these tools, and I just encourage executives, irrespective of what your title is, to just spend a bit of time. There's a lot of online tools, resources. IRMSA has a lot of training courses available, as well as most of the business schools in South Africa, that gives you exposure to the concepts of scenario planning and futures thinking. It just helps you to actually put on that risk management hat and think about the world differently in terms of what can happen and what can't. Like you said, Roshni, risks don't always immediately appear. Some of them obviously have a high velocity, like we had COVID really suddenly appearing on the horizon. Although on many risk registers, risk managers had already identified that there could be a global pandemic, some type of health crisis. And so the key issue is not to identify the exact risk, but to identify what those various themes are, and then doing some planning to make sure that your organization can respond in each one of those situations.
Thanks, Nicola. Christopher, from your perspective, what are your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. So Nicola just gave me a very nice link into IRMSA's role, when it comes to the risk profession and South Africa. And that is that boards think about risk because everybody actually manages risk intuitively. So you do risk management every single day, whether it's in your private life or in your professional life. But that, unfortunately, is not good enough. The tools that we need, given the way that the external environment has changed, in which boards lead us. Now, I talk about boards, but I also talk about the public sector. I actually do not see a difference in the leadership that is required specifically for South Africa when it comes to addressing the risks that we've identified. Back to the point on tools, I do believe the question that you asked, where do we stand? I do believe that one of our biggest blind spots is that South Africans are really resilient. We really get ourselves to the edge of the cliff and we never fall over. We always push back. And for us in the risk profession, for us at IRMSA, it warrants for us to highlight that the point Nicola made with regard to training and tools and understanding the benefits of adequate and effective risk management from the boardroom all the way down to the coalface should not be ignored. Roshni, you made the point, or actually the point was made quite clearly that COVID is on the radar, etc., etc. The issue for me, and what IRMSA has highlighted in the 2022 risk report, is that COVID actually also, because of the new lens that we've put on in the public and in the private space, COVID just highlighted other risks that were always there. We just never understood them clearly. And I think that's a second important point to make, is that once we started thinking differently about risk being both threats and opportunities, once we started understanding that the environment that we need to make quality decisions in are changing so fast that we need risk management, IRMSA got catapulted, actually the risk profession per se, got catapulted to the forefront of saying, what are the value propositions that you can bring to the table? How can you help us to become risk intelligent? How can you help us to become resilient so that we make better decisions? And more importantly, we make those ahead of the events materializing. And that is what risk management is all about. It's allowing us foresight so we could make good strategic decisions and we can execute accordingly.
Thanks, Nicola and Christopher. And you both made such valid points. The first concept being that by nature, business is dynamic. And therefore, risk management is a moving part constantly. And it's all about perspective, isn't it? And with so much going on externally and therefore internally in businesses and organizations, absolutely that is a collective responsibility, mainly to bring in those input and perspectives so that in the best interest of the strategy, the right decisions can be taken. And I think that's the key takeaway point, that risk management, it's not something that's happening now. If you're focusing on risk management now, the horse is bolted. It's about anticipating and predicting, and to what Nicola was saying, using effective scenario planning to just map out what's on the horizon and perhaps beyond the horizon. And in the IRMSA report, it was quite nicely packed out, with scenario planning being one of the steps. Listeners, you can go to the IRMSA website and download the report. We're not going to get into the nitty-gritty detail. But Christopher, when I read that report, what struck me was the results of the survey, which I found the response rate was low. So let's unpack that for the listeners. 633 respondents. Of those, 48% represented general management. Only 8% represented CROs or chief risk officers who responded. I think 7% was CEOs. And even the academics, who normally are quite interested in these things, represented 3%. Another interesting dynamic was the response was led by Gauteng, 56%, with Western Cape in second place, but with 14%. And if we can label them problem provinces like the Eastern Cape, only a 5% response rate, and Limpopo, 2%. Public sector, 55% response rate. Private sector, 40%, which was super interesting. And then of the private sector, most of the responses came from the financial services sector. Right. Christopher, how should we read these responses? And if my comment around the fact that the response rate is low is inaccurate, then please do correct me there too.
Okay. Yes, indeed. So historically, maybe just a quick reflection. The report started in 2015. That was our first release. And we started off with, I think, about 157 odd participants. And so we grew to the highest number was about 1,500 odd in 2019, 2020. I think, Roshni, what impacted the numbers per se was, of course, the pressures that COVID put on the way that we, for example, invite the participants, the time that they have to complete the surveys. So I think there was a COVID element in capping the sort of responses, but we've done two methodology changes as well in as far as who did we choose to participate. So we really were looking to involve leadership more so than general comment. And, from that point of view, we expected that there would be less. So instead of asking the masses to respond in their private capacity, we asked for leaders to respond on behalf of their organizations. So I think that's the one methodology change that we asked for this year. The second was that we worked through our professional bodies instead of targeting the membership directly. So instead of going to the IOD members, for example, or the Institute of Ethics, for example, directly to all the members, we asked the institutes to consolidate the view that represents the institute view and not necessarily just membership view. So those are the two methodology changes that we made. What is heartening about the change within the detailed statistics, though? We forever have really good support from public sector. So public sector really supports. So that was not a big change in as far as it's about a 50-50 if you want to argue a couple of percentages this way or that way. Financial service sector, always big. The insurance sector, always big. But there were some smaller participations that came through, if you look at the bottom, from the mining industry and the like. So that was a good, not shift, that was still a good trend that we saw. As far as the biggest positive that we've seen, and you've highlighted it right in the beginning, is the responses and involvement by general management. And that is where risk makes a difference. So what that told us is that we are succeeding as IRMSA and as the private and public sector in understanding that risk is not just for risk professionals. Risk is a basic tool that needs to be part of all leadership toolkits. Every single person that makes decisions in an organization has to understand risk. And so what we are seeing, and it correlates with our training, and it also correlates with our training statistics. Risk 101, for example, which is a sort of back to basics training, less in the professional space, far more in general management space. So that is a very constructive change. It does tell us that we're on the right track for allowing management, the people that are making decisions, that they are going to be better equipped to make more quality decisions going forward. So that's how we interpreted the statistics for this year. We are anticipating coming out of COVID now for the 2023 year, that the numbers would pick up again. People will have more time. People would be back in the office and that sort of thing. Not that that should be an impediment, but you know what? We appreciated the stresses and strains of COVID for this year.
Christopher, thank you for that. So I was very interested that financial services had a 31% response rate. And one would expect that, given that, economic sustainability and growth are key focus areas in South Africa. To me, the other two pillars of sustainability for a country like South Africa are education and healthcare. Those were at about a 3 or 4% response rate. Can you give us some insights into that?
Yeah, so our approach again, if you consider the footprint of the financial services sector and the insurance services sector compared to the education sector, the footprint is far smaller. So our reach is far wider in the financial sector, but we pretty much approach the Department of Education. We approach 6 or 8 universities or tertiary institutions and maybe 10 or so recognized subject matter experts in the education space. So it is to be expected, but it doesn't mean that the representation is compromised in terms of the size of the two populations that are out there to respond.
Christopher, thanks very much. Nicola, now getting into the report, talk us through the top 10 risks. And from your position sitting at the JSE and on the board of IRMSA, what does this mean to South Africa's future?
Oh, Roshni, so I think something else to also mention is that I also sit on the Risk Intelligence Committee, and Christopher, with other members of that committee, which is a diverse group of individuals that represent various sectors within the South African economy, have had a really challenging time to really land on what those top risks are. And we've really taken a long, hard look at the country in terms of potential future scenarios, etc., and also where we're standing today. And I think one of the key things that you said a bit earlier on is it's really important when you're doing risk management not to look at the immediate issues at hand, not to look at what the current crisis is, because that is a risk that's already materialized. It's an incident that's already in play. So it really is important to take that focus area away from the immediate circumstances and look into the future as far and wide as you can. And unfortunately, even while we did that, you would still see the top risks being one of the top ones that was tabled in the report, being the risk of South Africa potentially becoming a failed state. And we've actually had a lot of comments on this in social media where individuals are debating whether we actually are already at that failed state position. But I don't want to go into that discussion. I think if you'd like to, you're welcome to ask Christopher his views and the feedback. But certainly in the report, we do cite some success stories in terms of why we feel we're not a failed state. And SARS being one of those institutions as an example that really is a beautiful success story in the country. But just quickly talking about that number one risk, or that top risk, it's really important for us to now think about what are the things we can do to make sure that we avoid actually getting into that full-fledged fail state position. And for me, that's the most important thing that the IRMSA risk report drives out, is a call for action. And if I look at some of the work we've done at the JSE, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that now, but one of the things that I just wanted to highlight is our Enterprise Acceleration Program, which I think is such an important program that we had to do to make sure that we support small and medium enterprises in South Africa, make sure that we scale up, we're able to raise capital and we can create jobs. And there's various initiatives that we're running within that portfolio, such as the speed coaching sessions that we've just launched now in February, and that are running towards the end of this year. But yeah, just to get back to the top risks again, some of the others that talk through the breakdown of ethical and legal principles across society. Something that's also very important for us is really going back to our ethical principles. We make sure from the JSE side that we complete the GIBS ethics survey every year so that we can track how we've progressed over the years compared to each other in terms of our resources within the JSE group. But we also make sure that we give guidance to our listed entities in terms of that. And it's not directly related, but one of the things that we did do towards the end of last year is we also launched our sustainability and climate disclosure guidance, which was really important because it really promotes transparency and good governance and gives a guide to the listed entities on best practice in both environmental, social, and governance disclosure spheres. And I think that just talks to some of the ethical elements, specifically if you talk about the governance bucket, the G in the ESG. And then the third risk that was cited talks about the unmanageable societal unrest and the breakdown of the rule of law. And I think that's a very important one for us to ponder about, because it really is a concern as to whether we will continue to see pockets of unrest and how far and wide those will spread. And what does that then mean for the fabric within South Africa? Does that end up destroying a lot of hope in the context of small businesses actually being hit the hardest when we have social unrest incidents like we saw last year, July? And I think the other thing is just to consider, how do we then go back to the point that I made a bit earlier, support programs for small and medium enterprises to make sure that they really are given as much opportunity and likelihood of success in South Africa, given that we have the societal unrest challenge. Because I think at the bottom of all of that is really the very high unemployment rate, which will only be addressed, in my view, if we end up building more businesses. And then the fourth one I'll quickly just talk about is the complete economic collapse, which is, as you've mentioned, probably why the economic sector is really a very large participation pool. I think also because it has become such an important and widespread sector within the South African economy. And I think just looking at the economic challenges we face, for us, the key thing again is making sure that we build better businesses, that we are able to scale our small and medium enterprises, and that at the same time, we're also able to promote diversity in terms of making sure that we build a more sustainable tomorrow. So one of the things that we've also done in terms of specifically just talking to the economic collapse side is one of the areas that we felt is important to support from an economy perspective is the private placements arena. And so we have launched a private placements platform towards the end of last year. And in the first 3 months of it being launched, we've announced that we've attracted more than 5 billion rand in investments, which is really exciting for us. And the JPP platform had brokered its first deal for a private hospital in Messina, which is on the border of South Africa and Zimbabwe. So I think for me, just to round off, and I'm sure Christopher wants to maybe also talk about some of the other risks cited in the report, but for me, just to end off here, it really is important to link those risks to actual actions being taken. What is your business doing to make sure that we contribute to economic development, to make sure that that risk of complete economic collapse does not realize? So let me leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Nicola. Before I hand over to Christopher to take us through the next 5, just want to ask you, from South African listed corporates, what kind of trends are you seeing as far as key risks reported goes? Are they stacking up along the similar lines of what you've just unpacked for us?
So that's an interesting question, Roshni. I sit on a couple of forums. One of them is the Financial Sector Contingency Forum, which is a forum that forms part of the Reserve Bank. So most of us that sit on that forum are either market infrastructures like ourselves, stock exchanges, depositories. There's also some of the banks and big insurance companies, MasterCard, Visa, those sorts of entities all represented in that forum. And we've actually just recently at the beginning of this year all reviewed our top risks. I also sit on the World Federation of Exchanges Risk Working Group. And similarly with other peer exchanges, we've compared all of our top risks. And I have to admit, it really does range quite widely. There's similar themes, but some of the things that come out quite strongly is more specific to threats potentially that industry has observed. So if I just look at the top risks that we've identified in the Financial Sector Contingency Forum, some of those major things that come out is that we are very concerned about electricity supply and water supply in the country. And so obviously there's a big concern in terms of making sure that those threat vectors don't realize and we have a complete collapse of our power grid, and that we have complete water shortages, because even though water might not be something very prevalent in financial services industry, we do use water a lot to cool down our data centers, and each family that works for financial services sectors obviously needs water for their livelihoods. So water has been a big theme that we've highlighted at the start of this year as a threat that we are more and more concerned about. So those are some of the two major ones. The third one that I would highlight is obviously something that's prominent in financial sector and all over the news at this stage is cybersecurity risks. So certainly is really important for us to protect our digital assets. We spend a huge amount of money to make sure that we protect our private information of all of our clients, that we make sure that none of our confidential information is disclosed. So definitely the technology risks is something that features also quite widely in the financial services sector. I have to admit, though, that we do talk a lot about some of the societal issues. As we've mentioned, linking into the social unrest, we talk a lot about economic factors, which talks about the economic collapse. One of the other major things is we talk about climate change, and what does that then mean for the financial services sector in the form of stranded assets and other types of issues, which really just means that we end up having certain sectors of the economy no longer being feasible and no longer contributing to the economic growth of the South African economy. And that's really for us one of the major concerns around climate change. And as I've mentioned, some of those other threats, also the water shortages linked to climate change. If I think about the World Federation of Exchanges and the discussions we've had there, some of the major risks that have come out now, because it's really prominent and front of mind, and we did this review earlier this year, is obviously social cohesion being eroded. And just generally no longer having all of that collaboration across the globe, which has also then, in many people's view, led to the war that we're seeing now in Europe, and the tension that we've seen and the unrest in Ukraine initiated by Russia. So really major concerns around what next in that space. Will we also see some response in terms of China and what they wanted to respond to on Taiwan's side, and what else will happen in that region? So certainly a lot of concern around social cohesion having eroded, which is one of the top risks in the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, which we did talk about at the World Federation of Exchanges. Similarly, cyber risk is a major theme. The third one that I'd highlight is third-party risk management. And that really is a major threat now in terms of many of our organizations use many suppliers to either provide some of the hardware or software, or they provide various other services to us, support us to help deliver our products to our clients. And you end up being exposed to them. And many of us are so connected, having suppliers all over the world. And we've seen that through the COVID pandemic. And now we're starting to talk about fourth and fifth party disclosures. You're not just exposed to those entities that you have an immediate contract with, your direct vendors, but you're also exposed to their vendors and their suppliers that potentially can't deliver their needs, that indirectly then ends up impacting you. So there's some of the major themes that we've picked up, but many of them link into some of the things that have been identified in the IRMSA risk report.
Thanks, Nicola. To help us segue into the next 5 that Christopher is going to share with us, do you want to just recap your top 5 that you've spoken about?
Sure. Thanks, Roshni. I just spoke about the failed state, the breakdown of the ethical and legal principles across society, the unmanageable social unrest, and then the complete economic collapse. And to some extent also have linked into the lack of skills to enable economic growth and the recovery, even though I didn't specifically mention that one. But I think it really is linked into the small and medium enterprises, and where we need to make sure that we grow in terms of investing in certain pockets of our economy so that we can enable economic growth and recovery. Thanks. So, Christopher, I'll then leave with the last 4.
With the last one. With the last one. Yeah, I'm just just kidding. Thank you for that. Thanks, Roshni. So indeed, you highlighted the interdependencies between, or the interrelationships rather, but also interdependencies between the 10 risks. And I think that is a key takeaway, that one looks at the risk profile for the country and that you understand that these risks in their own right are risks, but they are also exceptionally strong drivers. So when you look at something like speaking about a failed state, a couple of those risks must materialize first before we will actually end up in a failed state. So for example, we use the words, and there's a little bit of wordplay here, and this is where the conversation gets heated, or not heated, but it gets involved when one says, but these things are already happening in the country. Of course they are. Of course they are. We can see them. We experiencing them at a personal and at a professional and at organizational level. But the fact is, we are talking about a complete breakdown of, for example, ethical and legal. It's a complete breakdown. Yes, we have pockets of breakdown, and they may feel very significant, and I suppose they are quite pervasive. But similarly, we use the word unmanageable societal unrest. Now, yes, we did survive KwaZulu-Natal. We did see how close to the precipice we got, the old resilient. We didn't fall over. We managed to push back, but that was not good enough, which is, Roshni, what I needed to share with you to get to what does the risk of lack of skills mean? You have to look past just the education system. There are multiple layers of risk. This is a very complex risk. It does talk about our young population coming through the primary, secondary, and tertiary education. But it also talks about the education, knowledge, and experience of people in positions to make the right decisions. And this lack of skill is talking about the inability for us to make decisions that can change these risks. Because let me tell you, a lot of these risks, if you go back as far as 2016, 2015, we were talking about, Nicola, water supply, electricity supply. We were talking about local government, local municipalities failing. We were talking, and 7 years later, we are talking still about those. So when we look at the bottom 5 risks, we look at the lack of skills, we look at large scale disruptions due to and based on electricity or energy supply. We look at interruptions on our networks. Nicola spoke about cyber. This may even include the lack of adequate servicing of current infrastructure, the lack of providing infrastructure to support growth. And I'm going to come back to that point because that will be my closing, bringing it together when it comes to what is it that we need to do. It's not so much physical things. It's a different mindset. It's a different train of thought. It is breaking the paradigm, but I'll end off with that. And then, of course, we did highlight very specifically the loss of trade, but it's far more than just our ports. Considering our freight rail, considering ports, considering our air freight, it is an all-encompassing risk. Of course, at that particular point in time, given what happened in KwaZulu-Natal and what we realized our exposure, our vulnerabilities were and still are, we highlighted that as a risk. And then the whole issue about climate change. So I'll also just share a little bit of that in as far as drawing a parallel between that and COVID. But let me just go back and say, so when we talk about skills, yes, we are talking about our education system, but we are also talking about having leaders in place that can identify the right response strategies for the risks that are in place. Now, what am I implying? I am implying that we've learned from an IRMSA point of view that the risks of the future will not be addressed by the controls of the past. So what we had done in the past will not fix the things that we are faced with when we look in the crystal ball. And in that, Roshni, lies the challenge to public and private sector leadership. We need to think differently. We need to get the right people around the table so that we through systems thinking, through integrated thinking, through scenario planning, through building alternative futures, we can actually identify those choices way in advance. We can stress test them, and we can get out of this hole, this failed state flag that we are flying all the time. So that was, and then lastly, from a climate change perspective, Roshni, COVID, you know, Nicola will tell you, I was quite facetious. I ran a couple of webinars when COVID was still sexy and the topic. And so we ran a couple of webinars, and we would ask the audience to vote on whether they think it was a black swan or whether we should have known about it. And I will label it not the strangest thing, but the important outcome of that was that it was always a 50-50. Nicola, you will remember, you and I had a couple of, it would always be, some would say it's a black swan, some would say, no, we should have known about it. And in that lies the importance of us becoming skilled in risk management, the management of risk, using that information to make better decisions. And we've said that earlier on in the podcast. But when you look at the risks, cyber, we look at expansion and extraction of opportunity in the cyberspace, and not cyber just from an attack point of view, but from a leveraging point of view. How can we get public service to be far more productive and efficient by using what we have learned now through the COVID period? So, you know, for me, the focus is really when we look at the 10 risks. So I've covered the lack of skills, and I thought that was a very key risk to amplify. So what are we talking about? We're not just talking about misbehaving children in grade 3. We are talking about the entire landscape of education. Not just fees must fall, but what does education mean at a leadership level? We've spoken about electricity. I think I've said enough there, but you know, I need to highlight. I don't know if you've seen now, between 2,500 megawatts to 3,500 megawatt generation in renewable energy space is now being launched. So those are the sorts of risk response strategies that we should be looking forward to. That's, you know, what I wanted to highlight there. And of course, performance management. I don't know if you've seen in the recent press, people challenging leadership decisions, leaders being challenged in as far as their performances go. You've seen a lot of moving around. You've seen a lot of disciplinary hearings. The Zondo Commission, for example, the reports 1 and 2. All of a sudden, companies are phoning me to say, should we add this as a risk? Because, you know, will we be implicated? Will we be, Nicola highlighted it so eloquently, are we downstream to the impacts of this report? Because if you do not know who your third parties are and what their exposures are in the context of these risks that we are talking about, you could very well find yourself behind the 8 ball very quickly. And so I see that not just our report, I mean, our report did highlight a lot of conversation, not just in the media, on television, well, television's media, of course, but not just in the written press, but also on air, where people were talking about this. I constantly read the Daily Maverick when they speak about, are we a failed state? Aren't we a failed state? And I can see some of our information coming through there. Last comment on climate change. I want to talk about the similarities of how COVID-19 surprised us, knowing that pandemics, global pandemics, have been, and I stand to be corrected. I've gone back as far as 2008, World Economic Forum on their global radar. They had pandemics. That just became a white elephant in the boardrooms, both public and private. People said, no, it won't happen here. You know, we've survived AIDS and we've survived all of those other good things. It won't happen here. And that is the parting comment that I want to leave you with as far as climate change goes. We must please learn the lesson that these conversations should not be taboo. Because the next time we talk about climate change, it's March 2019 or 2020, March 2020, excuse me. COVID, March 20. Now we all have to run around and prevent the Armageddon. And I think that's the parting value proposition in highlighting that as our risk. And we've articulated, I think, it quite well in as far as saying it's not a risk in itself. The risk is our inadequate response to that. So we see it, we talk about it, but we do nothing about it. We don't make that future or futuristic based decisions on how to address that risk. We think past and we think it'll be good enough going forward. And so that's how the profile comes together. And I think that's a very important let go at the back end, is saying it's not so much climate change by definition, it is what we are doing about it, or the lack of that, is the risk that we're trying to highlight. Roshni?
Christopher, thank you very much, and congratulations to IRMSA for looking at a very complex landscape and coming up with the top 10. And, there's so much we can unpack in what you two have shared. And one thing I want to pick up on is this principle of probability. So think about the COVID pandemic. Think about things that happen, but we land up responding in the moment rather than planning ahead for the right risk mitigation plan. And so, Nicola, we spoke about this at the JSE conference in November 2019 around the short-termism culture that is pervasive now, looking at quarterly results or 6-monthly results. And if we're looking at futures, which in a business context, it's normally up to 20 years for multinationals, and deep futures, which for governments is up to 50 years. A lot of these things are known and put on the table, but because of that principle of probability, we've got to start being very careful around an overly optimistic or exuberant type of leadership, because their performance and their terms are short. So their performance, is based on 3-year or 5-year goals. And some of these mitigation plans take quite a while to play out. And I want to go into that a bit later when I looked at the IRMSA risk report and recommended plans. So despite the odds, the Rand has stayed quite buoyant. And last week, we got some good news, at least, that Moody's changed its outlook to stable. But the fundamentals are deeply concerning. I mean, our debt to GDP ratio, for those international listeners tuning in today, is that we're at 69%. That's set to rise to between 78%, according to National Treasury, by 2026. And some are forecasting up to 83%. Our debt is expected to rise to 1 trillion Rand within the next 3 years. Looking at the unemployment, which is a deep issue, we have the highest unemployment rate in the world at 35%. Behind us is Brazil at 13%, and Spain, interestingly, at 12.6%. 66% of youth in South Africa are unemployed, and 32% of females are unemployed. Corruption Perception Index, in 2008, we were sitting at 54 out of 180 countries. Today, or in 2021, we're sitting at 70th. I mean, these indicators, or let's call them key risk indicators, are not looking healthy. The report packs out some scenarios from the low road to the high road. Christopher, do you want to take us through these?
Yes. So we talk about a perpetual hangover, actually. So the low road, high road, that's more the Clem Santa looking, and of course, Clem also looks at a global scenarios. We work with Clem very closely when we discuss the scenarios that we come up, but from an IRMSA perspective, we've only got the 3. We talk about the perpetual hangover, so fake it until you make it sort of position. That's the second one, and then of course, creating our own future. Being in a position where we create the future for South Africa and we take ownership for those. Currently, when we look at the top risks that we've identified, Roshni, we believe we are in the perpetual hangover moving into fake it until we make it phase. So we on the gravel road, we are on the pothole. But if you want to talk about the low road, we are on the low road. But we have, of course, there's absolutely no point in having 3 scenarios out there and identifying where we are at and not sharing what we should be doing to get onto a different road, if you like. So from that point of view, and I'm sure we'll discuss that a little bit later, but that's how IRMSA has unpacked the 3 sort of focus roads, if you like, for our country. And yes, we would love to claim that we're on the yellow path, that we're on the fake it until we make it path. And of course, if we claim that we're a failed state, of course, we have to go down to the low road. And that's why we still believe that we have not yet hit the bottom of the barrel, and we can vacillate between the yellow and the green over the next 10 years, discounted by the fact that we're already in 2022. So you'll see that we are talking about, these are the actions that we are suggesting, and they're not particularly, spade digging a foundation action. They are more a change of thinking action, a change of systems action, a change of heart action. So, for example, just to give you an idea, we firmly believe that just by implementing consequence management, just by holding people responsible for what they are being paid for, would make a tremendous change across the entire top risk profile of what we've highlighted. I don't know if you've ever seen how well government actually puts together a performance plan, targets that gets measured, and so on. And of course, because we come from private sector, we know it happens in that sector. What gets measured gets done. We must now just start doing that, actually. So, when you talk about how do we move from fake it until we make it, until where we want to create our own future, well, that's one of the most important things that we need to get right. And there are many more, but I'm sure we'll get to that a little bit later. The question was about the roads. That's where we are. We're saying we're in the fake it until we make it, vacillating to the low road, and of course, wanting to get to where we create our own future.
Christopher, to own your own future, you need to have a vision of what that future potentially looks like. And in a country, leadership in private and public sector and civil society need to be aligned on that common vision or that common goal. And I guess one could say that the perpetual hangover might be from the fact that we're lacking that vision, and it comes down to leadership. Would you agree with that statement? Absolutely.
But I just need to, I was told never to use the word but, so let me use and. And we do not think, we being IRMSA and the Risk Intelligence Committee that have, and maybe just a mind bubble, risk is defined as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So whenever we do a risk assessment, we do it against objectives. And let it be known that we still believe that the NDP and the revised NDP 2030, the development goal set, are exceptionally good goals. They are the right goals for the country. We firmly believe that as the Risk Intelligence Committee. And that's why when you said, so it boils down to leadership, ethical and brave leadership, I said absolutely, because that is what we believe. Having the right people, having the skills in place, having commitment to ethical leadership and visionary leadership is together with then the rest. And I highlighted consequence management and systems thing and all of those good things. But indeed, Roshni, we absolutely support that view that you've shared.
And I love the word you put in there, heart. And I think heart-centered leadership brings in the vision and the inspiration that I think our country deeply needs right now. Nicola, we spoke about the short-term culture, we spoke about leadership, and it's about now getting from fantastic plans on paper to execution. So in the report, what are the key mitigation plans to move from this perpetual hangover state to the desired owning the future state?
Roshni, I'm just thinking actually while you and Christopher were talking as well, of another survey that was issued earlier this year, the Edelman Trust Barometer. the results of that survey, which is something I like to track as well. And one of the things that I think that really links in nicely with the IRMSA risk report and call to action is exactly what was highlighted in that report, which talks about NGOs and business being pressured to take on societal problems. And for me, it's not a concern, it's an opportunity. Because in that report, it highlights how much trust and faith most individuals have in the business sector. And it's so important for business sector to partner with the public sector to make sure that we are able to deliver, and partner with NGOs to make sure that we are able to change and turn around the narrative. So one of the things I thought I'd highlight is just in my personal capacity, I'm a big supporter of an NGO called Dignity Dreams, which distribute reusable sanitary pads to girls in underprivileged communities. And for me, that links into a number of issues. It keeps girls in school, which makes sure that we address the education element. It's sustainable in the way that it's been designed. It's environmentally friendly products. And it talks to the fact that we can actually make sure that we build more gender equality in society, because girls end up staying out of school longer because of not being comfortable to go to school if they don't have the right products. So I thought I'd link that in. And the other thing that I want to just add is that it's so important for businesses as well to make sure that we lead by example. So one of the things I'm quite proud of is at the JSE, we have gender neutral paternity leave or maternity, so parental leave essentially. So irrespective of whether you're a male or female, you have access to that privilege or that benefit. And for me, it just goes back to, given it was recently now in March, we celebrated International Women's Day on the 8th of March. And the theme from UN Women was gender equality today for a sustainable tomorrow. So for me, it all links into wanting to make sure that we build more sustainable businesses. And I think that links into a lot of the points that are also made in the IRMSA risk report. So making sure that in the way that we lead, we end up setting ourselves up for success. And it does need brave leadership, like Christopher's just highlighted. So a few of the things I just want to highlight that we've certainly done from the JSE side to make sure that we can lead by example, but also encourage our listed companies to lead by example, is that within our listing requirements, listed companies must report to their shareholders their gender representation at board level. And we also encourage them to disclose their female representation versus male representation. And also the racial representations, so not just gender, to make sure that from a diversity perspective, we are building better boards, we are building something representative of the South African ecosystem and people that live in the country. And then also, I've already mentioned to you that gender neutral parental leave, but we also have a pay parity principle. And the thing for us is to make sure that we disclose these things. And as a fairly small organization with just around 400 permanent staff and close to 500 if you add our contractors, we actually are quite insignificant and immaterial. But if we end up having leading policies like this in terms of pay parity, making sure that we have gender neutral policies, and also making sure that our representation at board and executive, I mean, both of those are over 60% in terms of female representation on both our exco and our board level, is just important in terms of actually showing how you end up implementing all of those things that are being recommended in the IRMSA risk report. I think the only one thing that I also wanted to just quickly add is that one of the things that's really critical for us, as Christopher said, when he spoke about the risk of inadequate response to the current and future climate change impacts that was highlighted in the report. And I think the emphasis here is really on the inadequate response. And so for me, that's where we saw the opportunity, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, just to launch that sustainability disclosure guidance as well as the climate disclosure guidance, which really just makes it practical for businesses. It's not mandatory. Companies don't have to adhere to it, but it gives them a tool that can help them better disclose. It gives them guidance on what are the things that are important for investors. There's such a growth in terms of global investors moving assets into companies that are more sustainable. Your business will not be invested in if you don't end up having that types of disclosures in place. We also issued this guidance specifically to make sure that it's a local perspective, but based on global best practice. So it really needs to be a practical tool, regardless of the size of the sector you're in, the size of your business. You can make a difference in your specific environment. Let me leave it at that for now.
Nicola, thank you. So, what you're probably putting on the table is that risk mitigation plans and what you do now needs to contribute to a future outcome. We speak about outputs and goals versus outcomes in the governance area. But to make it happen and to bring it live into the business, that requires a balance between long-term vision setting and short-term deliverables in alignment with that vision. And so it comes back to, Christopher, what you were positioning the importance of, and that is performance management. And not performance management to tick a box, but to say, how are we putting a brick in this 2030, 2035, 2050 wall? We're running out of time, and there's some important points that I want to cover. The executive summary in the report had a super interesting statement. It says the risks in South Africa are so interrelated and interdependent that the materialization of some of them may result in SA becoming a failed state. This can only be avoided if we very quickly develop and activate the skills we need to avoid disruption due to the various things we're dealing with. Now, the IRMSA CEO, Tabile Nyaba, believes that change comes through collaboration and cooperation. Absolutely. And Nicola, I think you've highlighted that nicely. Now, we're running out of time, so I'll position this as a general question to both of you. In a fragmented society with a high Gini coefficient and the deep trust deficit between business and government, is an integrated approach to risk management a practical ask in South Africa? Christopher?
Absolutely. I think it will not work otherwise. Let me just give you a couple of feeders into the reason why I say it is a requirement. Well, firstly, when we talk about risk, we talk about threats and opportunities. For us to get there, we have to understand the external environment. This is not just a question of jumping on risk identification and looking at what's right in front of you. Things I can see, touch, and feel, those aren't risks. So if risk is a threat and an opportunity, and we understand the external context, and we understand the people that play in that context, and we then understand what do we want to achieve in that space, then only, Roshni, do we actually identify the most relevant threats, but also the most relevant opportunities. Now, just space bank that a bit. Now looking at the capability of our state, looking at where we are at as a country, we are in a perpetual hangover. We are not doing great, but we still cling on to accepting international funding. Nicola's point about, do we make that available in the public sector? Do we allow the NGOs to handle that information? Do we allow private sector to handle the information? And then space bank that thought, and then talking about, so what do we do then? We have to recognize where there are superior systems of internal control, and we have to leverage those controls, whether they sit within the NGOs, in the private sector, in the public. Let's elevate them. Let's call them out as centers of excellence, and let's leverage them to achieve stuff. What am I talking about if I say stuff? Let's do better. And in doing better, Roshni, I actually think our unemployment is closer to 40%. If you look wider as far as the official definition of unemployment or how it's calculated, I think it's closer to 40. We can make inroads into all of these fundings that we get. And you would have seen, we received some grant funding for climate change, for all sorts of good stuff for our country. Leverage on an integrated way the application of those funds, because let me tell you, if we do it effectively, we are going to create jobs. We are going to bring people into the market. But we can only do that if government, society, and the private sector Now, when I talk about society, I talk about SMMEs, I talk about NGO, I talk about all of those bodies that sit between the two sort of outliers. When we bring all of this together and we recognize centers of performance, where are people good at? And let them do the work, let them apply the funding in such a way that we start generating opportunities for unemployment. I actually do believe that one of the biggest drivers across the 9 risks, not just consequence management, not just effective leadership, but specifically addressing unemployment, would alleviate the pressures that we feel and will turn the dial to the high road, to the future that we want to create for ourselves compared to the low road. I hope I answered your question.
You know, these questions are not easy to answer. So I think we'll just attempt them for this podcast and perhaps get into it in another one. Nicola, can I frame that question for you in a different way and from a different angle? If we are going to build this trust, it's about accountability and action to deliver on expectations. Now, chief risk officers, risk champions, risk managers are in quite a difficult position. Sometimes they're given the mandate, they're given the title, and the policy supporting them is beautiful, but sometimes they are obstructed in what they have to do. They are alienated from information and decisions, and sometimes they're even victimized. We've seen this with internal auditors, etc. And trust me, it happens with risk managers too. And so you can only manage what you know. What mechanisms are in place in South Africa to protect chief risk officers or those who are trying to do their best to manage and action risks?
Sure, Roshni. I think that's a very interesting perspective as well. I think one of the key things probably where I would start is just to say that one of the things that I've tried to make sure that I do in the role that I fulfill within the JSE as the Group Chief Risk Officer is that I have support into and a good and healthy connection with my board of directors, and in particular, the chairman of the risk working group. So to make sure that I have robust, challenging conversations with that individual or the others that sit on that committee from an independent director perspective, to get their views, to make sure that I can learn from their insights, and also to make sure that they understand that they've got an open communication channel between myself and them, which doesn't necessarily mean that I would go above my CEO's head and have that conversation with them. But the reality is the channel is open and it's available, and you have that guidance that you can get from them. And I think that would be really key, in my view, for any individual in this capacity to build up that sort of support structure, I would call. Because the reality is I've heard examples of a couple of other chief risk officers that have conversations with their executive, with their CEO, and raise risks, and the executive and the CEO just say, don't table it at the board. I'm not comfortable with that. You're exposing us, etc. And that's exactly the point, is you need to be in a position where the board members will phone you up. I have calls from the board members on my cell phone or on we do a discussion like we're doing now online, and they'd say to me, Nicola, frankly, now tell me, what are the major issues? And if in any way or form that differs from what I had presented in the risk report in front of the executive when we had the discussion with the board, there would be alarm bells. And so I think that is a key important structure from a governance perspective, is that you have the board members that can support you in that regard. It does get very tricky, as you've said. Obviously, for me, the other thing then is that you do have very well-structured whistleblowing protection type mechanisms, which is something that in South Africa we really can improve on a lot more. We've seen examples like Cynthia Stimple is a beautiful example at SAA, and it's really important for us to make sure that we use those examples and actually highlight those unsung heroes and the impact that they've made, and hear their feedback in terms of how we better build structures to protect those types of individuals, and also have a similar setup within your organization for anyone at any level to actually report to you any issues that they feel they might have been blocked not to raise to you. Because I just want to end off with this thought, because for me, it's not just about the risk manager actually highlighting the issues. It's about everyone within the organization, within their specific roles, that deal with issues that could actually become a threat that materializes and holds them back from achieving their objective. They see someone engaging with a supplier and someone actually knows that person, it's one of their friends. That's already the warning signs. And you want everyone, I'm just using one example, but everyone in their various roles to understand what are these things that can threaten our organization from actually becoming unethical in any way or form, as an example, which could derail us. And each one of those individuals should have the comfort to come to myself as the chief risk officer or any senior manager within the organization and raise these issues and have a robust discussion. And the reality is it isn't in place in all organizations. So what we've also put in place as an example in the JSE is to make sure that you've got a whistleblowing support mechanism for any individual within all levels of seniority. And if they're uncomfortable with a certain risk or something that's happened in their environment, they can disclose that and they can have through an independent channel, they can also be protected. And for me, that's important of how you actually get down to the real nitty-gritty issues that is in all levels of seniority within the organization, and each individual feels well protected if they do raise those issues.
Yeah.
Nicola, thank you. I think the need for whistleblower protection came through strongly in one of the Zondo Commission recommendations, and it's not in the area of risk management only. It's for those people who want to do the right thing and want to do a good job, and they need to be properly enabled back down to leadership. And I think boards have a huge role to play in making sure that there is an enabling structure and environment for this, and also protection. So the CRO has someone to go to if things they're saying is not being heard. So closing question, guys, and I'm mindful that we are running a little bit late. There is a clarion call in the report to risk managers to reinforce their strategic advisory role within their organizations. This may be a difficult question, but give it a bash. What one key action can boards in South Africa take to steer risk management into a sustainable strategic advantage? Nicola?
So I think one of the main things that a board can do is make sure that they sufficiently empower the chief risk officer, and they also make sure that they've got the right governance structures in place, so that they have either a platform like a risk board committee or in the audit committee, irrespective of where these issues are being discussed, but that the platform exists. I'm not sure it actually gets the right airtime at all organizations. I think there is an opportunity to just make sure, and you don't have to have a formal chief risk officer. Your CEO can just discuss, or even your CFO, all those major threats that you're faced with in your organization. But I think that will really enable a more risk-aware culture, is that your board actually says, guys, let's have discussions about scenario planning, about the future of your business. And have you compared that to reports like the IRMSA risk report, the World Economic Forum report? And the board really needs to make sure that they have a wide lens and a wide view, taking into consideration all of these major threats and asking the organization, how are you responding to all of these, and how do they relate to your business, and is it relevant and is it material in your environment?
Thanks, Nicola. Christopher?
I'm going to ask for to highlight two. My first one is to split the board audit and risk committee. If it's a combined function, to split that, to give risk a full agenda with full time allocation, so that, and Nicola's highlighted many of the issues just now, of what needs to be dealt with at a board, instead of just knowing or hearing that your report has been read, because there's not enough time on the agenda. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I would rethink the positioning of risk. I am not against GRC, governance, risk and compliance. Stop associating risk with compliance and audit and health and safety and security, and rather pocket risk management with your strategy outfit or your strategic thinking outfit. Have them in the same virtual space, let them collaborate, let them speak together to the board, and I think that would make a huge difference in the conversation that is had, and also the quality of the conversation, because it is all about the future. And currently, when you associate risk with governance and with compliance and with audit and the like, it becomes a firefighting discussion. It becomes a today, tomorrow, how do we fix this? It's really about dealing with hazards instead of having that deep foresight into the future. Those would be my 2 recommendations.
Thanks, Christopher. You've read my mind around becoming more discerning between the distinction between risk and compliance, because at the moment, that kind of 10, 15, 20-minute slot, if you're lucky, you get at the Audit and Risk Committee meeting to present
Absolutely.
your report. It becomes almost like a tick box exercise, but the power lies in context and deliberation and really getting all those perspectives in. Nicola, Christopher, lots to chat about, lots more still to unpack, I think, but we covered, I think, as much as we can for today. And thank you so much for your time and for sharing your insights. Listeners, if you go to the report on the IRMSA website, there's a beautiful quote that I want to read to you by Sunday Adelaja, who's a pastor, author, and journalist based in Kiev in the Ukraine. It says, the perfect scenario is when you are living your dream, when you have found your gift, and when you are working to bring it to perfection. The worst scenario is when you do not know your purpose of your day-to-day existence. And, just looking at what's played out in the Ukraine, I can't help but think that President Zelensky and the Ukrainians have shown us just what courageous leadership and active citizenship means in these times. So it's going to take that something extra. And as Christopher said, it's going to take heart to fight for the right thing and to do it. So our purpose-driven strategy work at Strategic Consulting certainly offers risk management and risk governance consulting to both private and public sector clients. Get in touch for an explanatory call. And remember that no business is too mature or too small to start talking about risk management. Thank you, listeners, for listening in, and we'll connect again in May, which is around the corner. Till then, remember to lift as you rise so that together we can thrive. Take care and bye-bye.